Ilara Voss is a 23-year-old Omega from the Grey March Pack who has spent her entire life being labeled wolfless and defective, stripped of opportunities, forced into laundry work, and eventually cast out into a war zone by her pack's elder council. Secretly gifted as a healer, she survives alone while carrying a vial of deadly Knight's Bane poison intended for herself as a final escape if life becomes unbearable. While crossing the Ashen Moor during the war between the Grey March Alliance and the Blackthorn Kingdom, she encounters Alpha King Kael Drakon, the feared Stormwolf, and discovers that he is her fated mate. Severely wounded and unconscious, she is rescued and brought to Kael's camp where he heals her and learns of the abuse and neglect she suffered. When Kael discovers the poison, Ilara reveals it was meant for herself, and in a desperate moment she kisses him to stop him from tasting it, strengthening their bond. As Kael protects her and encourages her to embrace her gifts, it is revealed that Ilara is not wolfless at all, but a legendary Moonblood wolf, a rare lineage of healers capable of extraordinary restorative powers. The Grey March elders had deliberately sealed her wolf when she was an infant because they feared her abilities and spent decades convincing her she was broken. With Kael's support, Ilara awakens, her wolf develops her healing powers, and returns to Grey March to confront those responsible for stealing her identity and future. The Elder Council is exposed and stripped of power, the pack is reformed, and the truth about her stolen wolf becomes public. When the healer Thorn, who originally sealed her wolf, reveals he acted under threat from the Council, Ilara chooses understanding over revenge. After a dangerous attempt by political enemies to permanently reseal or eliminate her, her wolf is fully released, and her powerful Moonblood abilities heal and inspire wolves across the region. Ilara and Kael formally claim each other as equals through the mate bond, transforming a relationship that began in mud, blood, and despair into one built on trust, respect, and love. In the aftermath, Ilara establishes a new healing center, reforms the treatment of Omegas and healers, helps rebuild Grey March society, and becomes a symbol of hope and change, while she and Kael build a future together no longer defined by fear, loneliness, or the poison she once carried as her only escape. The poison smelled like crushed lavender and something underneath, something metallic and wrong, like licking a copper pipe in winter. Ilara kept the vial pressed against her ribs, tucked inside the linen wrap she used to bind the wound that had never fully closed on her left side. 3 days she had carried it across the Ashen Moor, through mud that sucked at her boots and rain that turned the battlefield into a graveyard of rusted iron and white bone. 3 days walking toward the front lines of the Alpha King's war with enough Knight's Bane in a glass tube to stop a heart in 11 seconds. She was not bringing it for him. Her fingers had gone numb 2 hours ago. The thin wool cloak she had stolen from a dead scout provided almost nothing against the wind that cut across the moor, carrying the smell of smoke and old blood and the particular sweetness of yarrow growing wild between artillery craters. She had packed the yarrow into her side wound that morning, pressing the yellow flowers against the oozing gash until the bleeding slowed to a dark seep. It was a trick she had learned in the healer's quarter of the Grey March Pack, back when they still let her tend to the wounded back before the Elder Council decided that a wolfless Omega had no business touching injured warriors. Wolfless. The word sat in her chest like a stone she had swallowed years ago and never managed to cough up. 23 years old, and she had never shifted. Not once, not a flicker of fur beneath her skin, not a growl in her throat, not the faintest amber flash in her eyes. The pack healers had examined her at 12, again at 16, and finally at 19 when they declared her defective and reassigned her from the healer's quarter to the laundry. She spent 4 years boiling linens in a copper vat that left permanent red marks on her forearms, the skin there now mottled and rough as tree bark. But she had kept learning. At night, when the laundry building emptied and the other Omegas went to the communal sleeping hall, Ilara stayed behind and read. She had stolen medical texts one at a time from the healer's library, small enough to fit inside a pillowcase. Over 4 years, she had memorized every herb in the Grey March pharmacopoeia, including the ones marked with the black star that meant lethal. Nightshade, aconitum lycoctonum, fatal to wolves at any dosage above 2 drops, fatal to humans at 7. She had brewed it herself the morning they threw her out. The memory surfaced now sharp and unwanted as she stumbled over a half-buried breastplate and caught herself on her hands. Pain lanced through her left side, and she gasped, tasting iron at the back of her throat. The yarrow was failing. It had been Connell who delivered the news, Beta Connell, who used to bring her chamomile from his mother's garden when she worked late in the laundry. Connell, who once told her she had the most precise hands he had ever seen and that she was wasted on bedsheets. He came to the laundry at dawn 3 weeks ago, and he would not meet her eyes. The Elder Council has decided, he said, speaking to a point just above her left shoulder. Given the current conflict with the Blackthorn forces and the resource demands on the pack, all non-contributing members are to be released from pack protection effective immediately. Released as if she were a fish thrown back into a river. She had not argued, there was nothing to argue with. Connell's jaw was set and his hands were clasped behind his back, and she could see the way his fingers were white at the knuckles gripping each other hard enough to ache. That was the thing about Connell. He was not cruel, he simply lacked the specific type of courage required to be kind when it cost something. So she packed her stolen books into a canvas bag, wrapped the Knight's Bane vial in a strip of linen, and walked out of the Grey March compound into a war zone. The war between the Grey March Alliance and the Blackthorn King had been grinding on for 2 years. Ilara knew the broad strokes. Everyone did. The Alpha King of Blackthorn, a man whose name was spoken in the border territories like a weather warning, had consolidated 6 packs under his banner and was pushing west. The Grey March Alliance, her former pack among them, held the river line. Between them lay the Ashen Moor, 40 miles of cratered flatland where advanced parties clashed and retreated and left their dead to the crows. She was crossing that flatland now, alone, heading nowhere in particular. The poison was for herself, not yet, not today, but she carried it the way some people carry a photograph of someone they loved. A reminder that there was always a door she could walk through if the hallway got dark enough. It was a comfort so strange and cold, and she was not ashamed of it. A sound reached her through the rain. Not thunder, something lower rhythmic coming from the east. Hoofbeats, many of them, and underneath that the particular creak and jingle of armored riders' leather and chain and the clink of stirrups against steel flanks. Ilara dropped to the ground behind a mound of earth that might have been a grave. Her side screamed, and she pressed her hand against the yarrow poultice, feeling warm wetness spreading through the linen. The wound was opening again. She could smell her own blood now, cutting through the lavender and copper of the Knight's Bane, and she thought with the clinical detachment of a healer that she was losing too much. She needed to cauterize. She needed a fire, a clean blade, someone to hold her down. She had none of those things. The riders crested the ridge to the east, 30 of them, maybe more, in black armor that drank the grey light. Their horses were enormous, bred for war, and the lead rider sat his mount with the stillness of a man who had never in his life needed to prove he belonged anywhere. He was simply there. The world arranged itself around him. Even at 200 yards, Ilara could tell he was massive, broad across the shoulders, tall enough that his warhorse looked almost normal-sized beneath him. His hair was black and cut close, and a scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a clean white line that looked like someone had drawn it there with chalk. He wore no helmet. Kings did not apparently hide their faces from the battlefield. She knew who he was. Everyone in the Ashen Moor knew. Kael Drakon, the Alpha King of Blackthorn, the man they called the Storm Wolf, whose beast was said to be so large and so dark that scouts who had seen it in battle swore it cast no shadow, as if the darkness itself bent around him and refused to separate. Ilara pressed herself flatter against the mud. The vial dug into her ribs and she shifted it carefully, positioning it so the glass would not crack. Her healer's mind noted with detached interest that her heart rate was approximately 140 beats per minute and her vision was beginning to blur at the edges, which meant the blood loss was worse than she thought. Stay down, stay quiet, let them pass. But the wind shifted. It came from the west, pushing her scent east, carrying it directly into the path of 30 Blackthorn warriors and their king. She smelled it herself for a moment, the way her own blood and sweat and the lavender of the Knight's Bane mixed into something that a wolf would read like a book. Female wounded alone, Omega prey. The lead rider stopped. She could not see his face from this distance, but she saw the way his entire body went rigid in the saddle, the way his head turned toward her hiding place with the precision of a predator locking onto movement. His horse pawed the ground, and the riders behind him pulled up, short hands going to weapons. Ilara made a decision. She was not going to dive face down in the mud. If this was the end, she would meet it standing with the vial in her hand and the choice still hers. She stood up. The pain in her side was extraordinary. A white-hot wire threaded through her ribs and pulled taut. Blood ran freely now, soaking through the linen and wool and dripping from her fingertips into the mud. She swayed. The world tilted, and she locked her knees and forced it level. The Alpha King was closer than she had calculated. 100 yards, not 200. Her blood loss was affecting her spatial judgment. Another clinical note filed automatically. At this distance, she could see his eyes. They were amber, the deep burnished gold of autumn oak leaves, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that felt physical, like a hand pressing against her sternum. Something happened. She would never be able to describe it properly, not in the medical language she relied on, not in any language at all. It was like a string she had never known existed, running from somewhere behind her navel to somewhere outside her body, suddenly pulled taut. Like hearing a note of music she had been humming under her breath her entire life, except now it was real, played on an instrument she could not see, and it resonated in her teeth and her bones and the space between her ribs where she kept all the things she had never told anyone. The mate bond. No. Impossible. She was wolfless. The bond required two wolves recognizing each other across the invisible architecture of fate and instinct, and she had no wolf. She had nothing. She was an empty vessel, a body without the beast, and yet the Alpha King dismounted. He did not jump down or swing his leg over. He simply let go of the reins, and the horse and the ground arranged themselves to accommodate his descent. And then he was walking toward her across the mud, and she could smell him. Pine resin, wood smoke, the iron tang of old battle. And underneath all of that, something warm and specific, like the first breath of air when you open an oven door, in a cold kitchen, yeast and heat and the promise of something sustaining. She took a step backward, and her boot caught on the buried breastplate, and she fell. The vial, her hand went to it, instinctively catching it as it slipped from the linen wrapping. She clutched it against her chest, and the motion tore the wound open fully, and she felt something give inside her, a wet structural failure, and the pain crested and broke over her and pulled her down into the dark. The last thing she saw before she lost consciousness was the Alpha King breaking into a run, his face open and unguarded, in a way that did not match anything she had been told about the storm wolf, and his mouth forming a word she couldn't hear. She woke up warm. That was wrong. She catalogued the wrongness with the precise instinct of someone who had not been warm in 3 weeks. She was lying on fur, thick and dark, and the air smelled like wood fire and beeswax, and the particular dusty sweetness of a canvas tent that has been waterproofed with oil. Light came from somewhere above amber and flickering a lantern with a wick turned low. Her side did not hurt. That was more wrong. She pushed the fur down and looked. Someone had removed her cloak and her outer shirt and the linen wrapping. The wound was closed, not stitched, not cauterized, but closed, the skin smooth and pink as if it had been healing for weeks instead of hours. A poultice covered it, a fragrant with comfrey, and something she did not recognize, dark green and resinous. Her fingers went to her ribs. The vial was gone. Panic hit like cold water. She sat up, and the world swam, and she caught the edge of the camp cot and held on, breathing through her nose, counting heartbeats the way she did when she assisted in surgery back in the healer's quarter. 1, 2, 3. The tent resolved into clarity. It was large military, the kind that officers used. A table held maps and a brass compass and a cup of something that steamed. 2 chairs, one of them occupied. The Alpha King sat 5 feet away, watching her. Up close, he was even larger than she had estimated. His shoulders filled the camp chair, and his knees were spread wide enough to suggest that furniture in general was an afterthought in his life. The scar was more complex than she had seen from the field, not 1 line, but 3 parallel, like the claw marks of something with massive paws. "We'll fight." His hands rested on his thighs, palms down, and she noticed they were scraped raw mud packed under his nails as if he had been digging. He had been digging her out of the mud. She realized that with a clarity that felt inappropriate, clinical. The Alpha King of Blackthorn had gotten on his knees in a battlefield and dug a wounded Omega out of the earth. Between those raw, scraped hands, resting on one knee, was her vial. The knight's bane. Their eyes met, and the bond pulsed again, that impossible taut string vibrating in her chest. She flinched from it and saw him notice the flinch saw, the way his jaw tightened and his amber eyes darkened to something closer to rust. "Who did this to you?" His voice was lower than she expected, rough at the edges, as if he had been shouting orders for so many years that his vocal cords had given up on smoothness. It was not a question, it was a declaration that someone had done something and that someone was going to answer for it. "The wound is old," she said. Her own voice came out thin and papery. "Nobody did it. I fell. You fell onto a blade." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Something more dangerous. 3 weeks ago, based on the scarring pattern, and you have been walking with it open since." She said nothing. He turned the vial in his fingers, holding it up to the lantern light. The liquid inside was the color of a bruise, deep purple edging to black. "I know what this is," he said. "Knight's bane." My war apothecary identified it in approximately 4 seconds. He seemed very disturbed. He held it up higher, tilting it so the light caught the surface. "What I have not been able to determine is who you were carrying it for." Ilara watched the light move through the poison and thought about lying. She thought about saying it was a weapon, that she was an assassin sent by the Grey March Alliance, that she had been ordered to kill him. It would be simpler. It would make sense to him. Assassins were a problem he knew how to solve. But the bond was doing something to her that she resented. It was pulling the truth up through her throat like thread through a needle, and she was too tired and too empty to resist it. "It was for me," she said. The silence that followed had weight. She could feel it pressing against her skin, heavy and warm, like standing too close to a fire. The Alpha King did not move. He did not blink. The vial was motionless in his fingers, then he uncorked it. She lunged forward, pain-forgotten instinct overriding everything. The word came out of her before she could stop it, raw and desperate. "No." He raised the vial to his lips. She crashed into him, grabbing for his wrist, and it was like trying to stop a tree from falling. His arm didn't move. Her hands wrapped around his forearm, and she could feel the muscle beneath his skin, dense and warm. And the bond sang in her blood so loudly she thought her teeth would crack. He tilted the vial, and she felt a drop of the night's bane touch his lower lip. And she did the only thing she could think of. She kissed him. Her mouth covered his, and she tasted the poison bitter and floral. And she pulled it from his lip with her tongue, drawing the night's bane into her own mouth and swallowing. 7 drops for a human, 1 drop for a wolf. She had taken perhaps half a drop, enough to make her tongue go numb and her vision swim, not enough to kill. He made a sound against her mouth, a rumble that started in his chest and traveled through his ribs and into hers. His free hand came up and cupped the back of her head, his fingers threading through her matted hair. And for a moment that lasted either 1 second or the rest of her life, the Alpha King of Blackthorn kissed her back, then he pulled away. He held her at arm's length, both hands on her shoulders, and the vial was on the ground between them, the remaining poison soaking into the packed earth floor. "You," he said, and his voice was not steady anymore, "would rather swallow the thing that was meant to kill you than let it touch me." She was shaking. Her tongue was numb, and her lips tingled with the night's bane, and her side had opened again, a warm bloom of blood spreading through the fresh poultice. She should be analyzing this. She should be calculating the toxicological impact of the dose she had ingested. She should be doing anything other than sitting on the floor of an enemy king's tent with his hands on her shoulders and his taste in her mouth. "I am a healer," she said. It was the only thing that came out. His eyes changed. The rust gold shifted to something brighter, hotter, and she watched his pupils contract and expand, the wolf behind them pressing forward. She could almost see it, the beast he was famous for, the one that made seasoned warriors turn and run. It should have terrified her. It did not terrify her. "You are my mate," he said, "and you are a healer, and you are walking across a battlefield with poison meant for your own heart." He paused. "Who threw you away?" she told him. Not everything, not yet, but she told him about the Grey March Pack and the Elder Council and the 4 years in the laundry and the word wolfless spoken like a diagnosis of something terminal. She told him about Connell delivering the eviction and the way his knuckles had gone white. She told him about the yarrow and the stolen medical texts and the night she brewed the night's bane in a copper pot over a fire made from the last of her belongings. He listened without interrupting. She noticed that his hands had moved from her shoulders to her wrists, holding them gently, his thumbs pressed against her pulse points. Monitoring her heart rate, she realized. Whether he knew it or not, the Alpha King was taking her vital signs. When she finished, the tent was quiet. The lantern had burned lower, painting his face in deeper shadows. His thumb moved against her wrist, a slow circle. "Your wound needs professional attention," he said. "Not field poultice. My surgeon is half a mile back with the main camp. I can suture it myself if you give me a needle and catgut," she said. His eyebrow rose a fraction of an inch, barely visible, but she caught it. I have closed wounds on 27 different patients," she said, under candlelight in a laundry building using sewing needles. "I sterilized with boiling water and thread I unraveled from bed sheets. I have set 4 broken bones, treated 11 infections, and performed 1 field amputation on a scout whose leg was crushed by a falling timber. All without formal training, without a healer's license, and without anyone in my pack knowing, because an Omega is not permitted to practice medicine." He stared at her. She met his gaze and did not look away, and the bond between them hummed like a plucked wire. "You performed a field amputation," he said. "The scout lived. He walks with a prosthetic now. He thinks a traveling healer came through in the night." She paused. "I left before dawn so no one would know it was me." The Alpha King released her wrists. He stood up and crossed the tent in 2 strides and opened the flap. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of rain and iron. He spoke to someone outside his voice, carrying the flat authority of a man whose orders did not require the word please. Bring me Surgeon Vasek. Bring me the field medical kit, and bring me the Grey March prisoners we took at the river crossing yesterday. He turned back to her. His expression was impossible to read a topographic map of a country she had never visited. But his eyes, those amber wolf's eyes, were burning. You are going to suture your own wound, he said. Because you clearly can. And because I suspect you would find it intolerable if I didn't let you, and then you are going to tell me exactly which members of the Grey March Elder Council ordered your removal. And then he said, and the rumble was back in his voice, the one that made the canvas walls tremble, you and I are going to discuss the fact that you are my mate and I am not letting you walk back into that wasteland. Not today, not any day, not with poison or without it. She should have argued. Everything in her training, her 4 years of survival, the carefully constructed architecture of expecting nothing from anyone told her to argue, to refuse, to find the nearest exit and disappear into the rain. Instead, she said, I will need hot water, a clean cloth, and better light. He almost smiled. It transformed his face so completely that she had to look away because the Alpha King of Blackthorn had dimples, actual dimples, and that was information she was not prepared to process. The surgeon arrived within the hour. His name was Vasek, and he was a compact, precise man with silver hair and hands that moved with the economy of someone who had been cutting and stitching for decades. He laid out his instruments on a clean cloth and stepped back and watched as Ilara examined the wound in her own side with the detachment of a doctor and the familiarity of a patient who had been managing her own injuries for years. Clean entry, she said, probing the wound edge with a fingertip she had sterilized with alcohol from Vasek's kit. The blade caught between the 8th and 9th ribs, shallow enough to miss the lung, but deep enough to nick the intercostal muscle. It has been opening because I have been walking, and the muscle contracts with each step. Vasek leaned forward. Intercostal, he repeated. Where did you learn that word, anatomy of the lycanthrope body, Theron, 3rd edition, she said. Chapter 14, Thoracic Musculature and Common Combat Injuries. I wrote a chapter in that book, Vasek said. Ilara looked at him. Chapter 26, she said, Surgical Intervention in Field Conditions with Limited Supplies. You recommended using spruce resin as a temporary adhesive when suture material is unavailable. I used that technique twice. Vasek turned to the Alpha King, who was standing in the corner of the tent with his arms crossed. Where did you find this woman? He asked. She was unconscious in the mud carrying enough Knight's Bane to kill my entire war council, Kael said. She is also my mate. Please assist her with whatever she needs. Vasek looked at Ilara. Ilara looked at the suture needle in her hand. The bond hummed between them all, connecting everything like an underground river she could suddenly feel flowing beneath the tent floor. She sutured the wound herself, 14 stitches precise and even, while Vasek watched and occasionally nodded. Kael did not watch. He turned his back and faced the tent wall, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid line of his spine, the way his fists opened and closed at his sides with each pass of the needle. The bond transmitted his distress to her like a radio static, a low background hum of something she could only describe as protective fury turned inward because he had no external target. When she tied off the last stitch and cut the thread, he turned around. His face was carefully blank, but his eyes were wet. She pretended not to notice, he pretended not to know she was pretending. It was the kindest exchange she had ever had with another person. The Grey March prisoners arrived the next morning, 3 of them, low-ranking warriors captured during a skirmish at the river, muddy and frightened and smelling of old sweat and fear. Kael had them brought to the command tent, and Ilara stood in the corner and watched from behind a partition unseen. She recognized one of them, Doran. He used to throw his laundry at her head instead of placing it in the basket. And once, when she had asked him to remove the mud from his boots before stepping on the clean sheets, he had grabbed her wrist and twisted until something cracked. A hairline fracture of the 4th metacarpal. She had splinted it herself with a wooden spoon and strips of linen from the laundry. Doran looked smaller than she remembered. Without his pack around him, without the hierarchy that placed him above her by the simple arithmetic of having a wolf and being male, he was just a man in dirty armor kneeling on a dirt floor, afraid. The Alpha King sat in his camp chair and asked questions in a voice that never rose above conversational. The questions were military supply lines and troop positions, and the prisoners answered with the desperate eagerness of men who understood that cooperation was not optional. Then Kael said almost casually, "Tell me about the Omegas in the Grey March compound. How are they treated?" Doran's face changed. Something flickered across it too fast for Ilara to name. Not guilt, not exactly. more like the expression of a man who hears a question he has never considered and realizes in the asking that the answer is not something he wants to examine under good light. They are provided for, Doran said carefully. Housing, food, work assignments, what kind of work, laundry, cooking, cleaning. Doran paused. Some of them serve in the healer's quarter if they have aptitude. And if they do not have a wolf, Kael said. If they are deemed wolfless, what? Then Doran's mouth opened and closed. He looked at the other prisoners, but they were studying the floor with intense focus. They are, Doran swallowed. Released from service eventually, if they cannot contribute. Released. Kael repeated, into a war zone with no supplies, no protection, and no pack bond. Doran said nothing. His jaw worked silently, and Ilara saw it the single moment she would remember long after the rest of this scene faded. His eyes dropped to his own hands, scarred and dirty, and something moved across his face that looked like the beginning of a thought he had spent years refusing to finish. The ghost of recognition, not repentance, nothing so clean as that. Just the flicker of a man seeing for the first time the shape of the thing he had been part of. Then it passed. His jaw set, his eyes went flat. It is pack law, he said. The Alpha King stood up. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way large predators move when they want their prey to understand that speed is available but not necessary. He walked to Doran and stood over him, and Doran looked up, and Ilara watched the blood drain from his face like water from a cracked glass. Kael did not touch him. He did not need to. His presence alone was sufficient. The wolf behind his eyes pressed forward, and the tent seemed to darken at the edges as if the shadows were gathering around him, thickening, taking shape. You will return to the Grey March Alliance, Kael said. All three of you. You will carry a message from me to the Elder Council. The message is this. The woman you released is my fated mate. She is under my protection. Every injury she received under your care will be answered for. You have 30 days to present your leadership to me for judgment. If they do not come to me, I will go to them, and I will not come alone. He stepped back, the shadows receded, the tent lightened. Go, he said. They went. Ilara stepped out from behind the partition. The Alpha King was standing at the map table, his palms flat on the surface, his head bowed. The candlelight caught the scar on his face and turned it golden. You didn't hurt them, she said. He turned his head just enough to look at her from the corner of his eye. Did you want me to? No. She paused. But I expected you to. He straightened. I know what they say about me, that I am a beast, that I cannot be reasoned with, that I slaughter prisoners and burn compounds and leave nothing but ash. He picked up the brass compass from the table and turned it in his fingers, a nervous gesture that seemed wrong on a king but right on a man. Some of it is true. Some of it I encouraged because fear is cheaper than war, and I lose fewer soldiers when the enemy retreats without fighting. And the rest, she said, the rest is what happens when you spend 15 years building an army and a kingdom, and you forget that the point of building something is to have someone to share it with. He set the compass down. I stopped looking for my mate 3 years ago. I assumed the bond had passed me by. A punishment maybe for the things I have done. He looked at her directly, and the amber in his eyes was not burning. Now it was quiet banked coals. And then you stood up out of the mud with poison against your heart and blood running down your side, and you looked at me like I was a problem you were trying to solve. And my wolf, who has not been quiet in 15 years, went still. She felt it then, the bond, not as a pull or a hum, but as a settling. Like a bone clicking back into its socket, like a door closing behind her and realizing it was not a trap, it was a home. I am not what you expected, she said. You are exactly what I needed, he said, which is worse because it means I cannot let you go even if you ask me to, and I suspect you are about to ask me to. She was. The words were right there lined up behind her teeth. I should leave. I am a danger to you. I have no wolf and no pack and no right to be the mate of a king. All the architecture of self-erasure that had been built in her over 23 years, brick by brick, each one inscribed with the word unworthy. But the bond, the impossible bond. She had no wolf, and yet it was there, as real as the stitches in her side. As real as the taste of night's pain still ghosting on her tongue. What if there is something wrong with me, she said. What if the bond is a mistake? Kael crossed the tent. He moved into her space, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat of him, the particular warmth of a shifter's body running 2 degrees above human, and the bond between them vibrated like a tuning fork pressed against glass. My wolf chose you, he said. My wolf has never made a mistake, and if the bond is wrong, then let it be wrong. I will take the wrong version of you over the right version of anyone else. He paused. But, Ilara, the bond is not wrong, and you are not wolfless. You are locked, and I think you know that. The word hit her like a physical blow. Locked. She had read about it buried in the footnotes of a text so old the pages crumbled when she turned them. Wolves who were sealed at birth, their beasts trapped behind a barrier that could only be broken by extreme trauma, extreme power, or the recognition of a fated mate. It was considered a myth, a healer's fairy tale. The chapter had been 3 paragraphs long and annotated with the word unverified. How she whispered. "Because I can feel her," he said. "Behind the wall, she has been scratching at it since the moment I touched you. She is frightened and she is angry and she has been alone in the dark for 23 years. His hand came up and his fingertips hovered over her chest, not touching, trembling slightly. "Let me help you." She did not say yes. She did not say no. She put her hand over his and pressed it flat against her sternum, and the bond detonated. It was not gentle. It was not the soft, warm glow that the stories described. It was like being struck by lightning in a room with no windows, light exploding behind her eyes, her spine arching, her mouth opening on a sound that was not a scream and not a howl, but something between the two. Something that had been locked in her chest for 23 years and was finally clawing its way out. The wolf came. She came in pieces, in fragments like a mirror, reassembling itself. Ilara felt her beneath her skin, massive and wild and incandescent, with rage and relief, a beast who had spent 2 decades alone in a cage with no light and no sound and no pack, and who was now being offered all 3 at once. The shift did not complete. Ilara's body was not ready, not yet too malnourished and too wounded for a full transformation, but the wolf pressed against her skin and her eyes flashed not amber but silver, bright as mercury. And the tent filled with a scent that had not been there before. Winter jasmine, frost on stone, ozone before a lightning strike. The Alpha King's hand was still on her chest. His eyes were wide, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked like a man who had been surprised. "Silver," he breathed. "Your wolf is silver." Ilara did not understand, not yet, but Surgeon Vasek, who had been walking past the tent and stopped in the entrance when the scent hit him, understood immediately. He dropped the medical bag he was carrying, and it hit the ground with a heavy thud, and he said one word in a voice that was not calm at all. Moonblood. The word spread through the camp like fire. Within an hour, every soldier in the Blackthorn vanguard knew that the Alpha King's mate, the wounded Omega he had pulled from the Ashen Moor mud, carried a silver wolf, a Moonblood. The rarest lineage in recorded lycanthrope history, a bloodline thought to have died out 2 centuries ago. Moonblood wolves were healers of a kind that defied medical science. They could knit bone and close wounds and purge poison through touch alone. Their blood was silver when it hit the air. Their howl could calm a raging wolf from 100 miles away. Ilara sat on the edge of the camp cot and listened to Vasek explain this to her and felt the wolf pressing against the inside of her ribs, warm and enormous and furious. And she understood with the cold clarity of someone who has finally been given the diagnosis for a disease they have carried their whole life. The Grey March Pack had not discarded her because she was defective. They had locked her wolf because they were afraid of what she was. The Elder Council had known, they had always known, the lock had not been an accident of birth. It had been placed there deliberately by a healer whose name she would later learn was Thorn on the order of the Elder Council when she was 3 days old. Because a Moonblood wolf could not be controlled. A Moonblood wolf owed allegiance to no pack structure, answered to no alpha command, healed whoever she chose. She was an anomaly in a system built on hierarchy, a variable that could not be contained. And so they had contained her the only way they knew how. They had taken her wolf, they had told her she was empty, and they had put her in the laundry to boil sheets until she either died or walked away. Kael was very quiet when she told him this. They were alone in the tent. Vasek dismissed the guards posted outside, the lantern burning low. He sat in his chair and she sat on the cot, and the bond between them was a solid thing. A bridge she could feel with her feet, and the wolf inside her pressed against the barrier and whined. The barrier was weakening. She could feel it crumbling at the edges like old mortar, the Moonblood heritage leaking through. Her fingertips glowed faintly silver when she was not concentrating, and twice in the last hour she had accidentally healed small things, a bruise on her arm, a cut on Vasek's hand that closed when she took his pulse. "You are angry," Kael said. She looked at her hands, the silver glow pulsed beneath her skin in time with her heartbeat. "I am trying to determine," she said carefully, "whether anger is a medically appropriate response to learning that your entire life has been a lie engineered by people who were supposed to protect you." "It is," he said. "Good," she said. "Because I'm very angry, I know," he said. "I can feel it through the bond. My wolf is responding to it. He wants to go to the Grey March compound, and he wants to take it apart stone by stone, and he wants to bring you, every single member of that Elder Council, on their knees." He paused, and I am inclined to let him. She stood up. The tent seemed smaller, the air thicker, and the silver light from her hands cast moving shadows on the canvas walls. I need you to understand something, she said. I did not survive 4 years in a laundry and 3 weeks on a battlefield and a wound that should have killed me just to watch someone else fight my battle. He looked at her. The amber in his eyes was very bright. What are you saying? He said. I am saying that when you go to the Grey March compound, I am coming with you, and the Elder Council is going to face me. Not your wolf, not your army, me. The Alpha King of Blackthorn, who had conquered 6 packs and unified the Eastern Territories and whose name made grown warriors flinch, smiled at her. It was not the almost smile from before. It was a real one, slow and warm and devastating. There she is, he said. The march to the Grey March compound took 3 days. Kael sent riders ahead, not with threats but with a formal challenge under the old laws. Challenge by mate. It was a provision so ancient that most packs had forgotten it existed, written into the founding codes by wolves who understood that the mate bond wasn't merely personal but political. If a pack harmed the fated mate of an alpha, that alpha had the right to demand accounting on their own territory under their own laws. The Grey March Elder Council had 30 days. Kael gave them 3. Ilara rode beside him. She had never ridden a horse before, a fact she disclosed with the same clinical neutrality she applied to everything. And he gave her a mare named Suit, who was old and patient and who smelled like grain and dust and warm hay. By the 2nd day, she could sit the saddle without gripping the pommel. And by the 3rd day, she was comfortable enough to work while riding, mixing poultices and grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle balanced on the saddle bow. She treated 14 soldiers during the march. Word had spread that the Alpha King's mate was a healer, a real one, with silver light in her hands and the kind of calm, steady competence that wounded warriors trust her immediately. They came to her with infected cuts and badly set bones and a persistent cough that had been moving through the ranks. She treated each one with the supplies from Varsek's kit and her own knowledge and the growing silver power that leaked through the crumbling barrier in her chest. Varsek watched her work with the expression of a man revising a significant number of his professional assumptions. Your suturing technique is unorthodox, he said, watching her close a deep laceration on a scout's forearm. You use a running stitch where I would use interrupted, but your wound closure rate is better than mine. The running stitch distributes tension more evenly along the wound edge, she said. I developed it because I was working with sewing needles, which are thicker than surgical needles and create larger puncture sites. The running stitch minimizes the number of puncture points. Vasek took out a small leather journal and began writing. On the 2nd night, Ilara woke to the sound of the wolf. Not hers, Kael's. He was standing at the edge of the camp shirtless despite the cold, his back to her. She could see the shift rippling under his skin. His shoulders broader than they should be, dark fur pressing through like grass through pavement. His wolf was close to the surface, and the sound it was making was not a growl or a howl, but something lower, a frequency she could feel in her bones. Distress. She walked up behind him and put her hand flat between his shoulder blades. His skin was burning hot, slick with sweat, and under her palm she could feel the wolf thrashing like a fish in a net. He flinched. It has been bad since the war started, he said without turning around. The control he used to be manageable. Now he wants out all the time. He wants blood or he wants you, and I cannot always tell which and that. He stopped. His voice was raw. That scares me more than any battle. Ilara pressed her hand harder against his back. The silver light came unbidden, flowing from her palm into his skin. She felt the wolf beneath his surface, enormous and dark and churning, with 15 years of loneliness and violence. And she did what she would have done with any patient in crisis. She was present. She was steady. She let the Moonblood do what it was meant to do. The wolf stilled. She felt it happen, a gradual unwinding, the beast settling like silt in disturbed water. Kael's breathing slowed. The fur receded. The impossible heat of his skin dropped to merely warm. He turned around. In the moonlight, with the silver glow still fading from her hands, he looked younger than she had ever seen him. Not the storm wolf, not the Alpha King, just a man, exhausted and afraid, who had spent 15 years carrying a beast he could not quiet. How he said. I do not know, she said. It is not in any of the books I stole. He laughed. It was a broken sound, half sob, and he sat down on the cold ground and put his face in his hands, and Ilara sat beside him, their shoulders touching. And the bond between them was so quiet and so sure that she could hear his heartbeat as clearly as her own. They reached the Grey March compound on the morning of the 3rd day. It looked smaller than she remembered. The stone walls were gray and streaked with lichen, and the gate was iron, and the courtyard smelled the way it had always smelled: old cooking grease and wet fur and the sharp chemical bite of lye from the laundry. The Elder Council was waiting. 7 of them standing in a line in the courtyard, their faces the carefully arranged masks of people who understood they were about to be measured by someone who found them wanting. At the center stood Elder Mirren, the head of the council, a tall woman with white hair and dark eyes who had signed the order to seal Ilara's wolf when Ilara was 3 days old. Behind them, gathered along the walls and in the doorways and leaning from the windows, was the rest of the Grey March pack. Hundreds of faces, some curious, some afraid, some wearing expressions of genuine confusion because they had never imagined that the quiet Omega from the laundry would return on horseback beside the most feared Alpha on the continent. Ilara dismounted. She had practiced this dismount for an hour the previous evening, determined to stumble, and she landed cleanly, her boots hitting the cobblestones with a sound that echoed in the silent courtyard. Kael dismounted beside her. His 30 warriors fanned out behind them, black armor gleaming a wall of discipline and implied violence. But the Alpha King didn't step forward. He stood half a pace behind Ilara and to her left, a position that any wolf would recognize immediately. He was ceding the ground to her. Elder Mirren's eyes moved from the Alpha King to Ilara and back. Her face was carefully neutral, but Ilara, who had spent 23 years learning to read the micro-expressions of people who had power over her, saw the edges of something she had never seen on the Elder's face before. Uncertainty, Ilara Voss Moran said. Her voice was steady and measured and completely devoid of warmth. You were released from pack service 3 weeks ago. Your presence here with an armed force constitutes a violation of— I was not released, Ilara said. Her voice carried across the courtyard, and she was surprised by the sound of it, clear and level, the voice of a woman who had sutured her own wounds and walked across a battlefield and kissed poison off the lips of a king. I was discarded after being deliberately crippled at birth by a healer acting on the orders of this council. Silence. The kind of silence that has mass. My wolf was sealed. Ilara continued. A Moonblood wolf, you knew what I was, you were afraid of what I was, so you locked her away and you told me I was empty, and you let me believe it for 23 years. She felt the wolf inside her rising, pressing against the barrier. And this time she did not fight it. The silver light bloomed from her hands, from her skin, from her eyes, filling the courtyard with a luminescence that had nothing to do with the pale morning sun. The assembled wolves gasped. Someone at the back of the crowd made a sound like a prayer. Mirren's mask cracked. Not much. A hairline fracture visible only because Ilara was watching for it. The Elder's eyes widened and her nostrils flared, and Ilara saw it then, what she had come here to see, not remorse. Mirren was not a remorseful woman, and Ilara did not expect her to become one. What she saw was older and more complicated than that. She saw the face of a woman who had made a decision 23 years ago based on a calculation of risk and order and pack stability, who had weighed the threat of an uncontrollable wolf against the life of a 3-day-old child, and who had chosen order, and who was now standing in the silver light of the thing she had tried to bury and understanding perhaps for the first time the full weight of what she had done. It was not enough, it was not justice, and it was not closure, and it was not the dramatic reckoning that the stories promised, but it was real. It was the actual face of the actual person who had decided that Ilora's life was an acceptable cost. And Ilara looked at it and memorized it and filed it away in the place where she kept things she would carry but not be crushed by. Kael stepped forward. Under the old law of challenge by mate, he said, and his voice rolled across the courtyard like distant thunder. I claim the right of accounting for every harm inflicted upon my fated mate during her time under your protection. The specifics are these. 1 count of deliberate wolf sealing performed on an infant without consent. 23 years of enforced servitude under false pretenses. Denial of medical training to a gifted healer. Physical assault by pack members, including a fracture of the 4th metacarpal that was never treated by your healers, and expulsion into an active war zone without supplies, protection, or provisions. He paused. The courtyard was so quiet that Ilara could hear a crow calling somewhere on the other side of the wall. The penalty under old law is dissolution, Kael continued. Your elder council is dissolved. Your healer Thorn, who performed the sealing, will submit to questioning by my surgeon. Your pack will be offered the choice of integration into the Blackthorn Alliance or peaceful independence under a new council elected by the full membership, including Omegas. He looked at Myron. You, he said, will live with the knowledge of what you did. I am not going to kill you. Killing you would be simple, and simple is not what you deserve. You deserve to watch her become everything you tried to prevent. And you will. Mirren stood very still. The courtyard light shifted as a cloud passed over the sun, and in that moment, in that particular quality of gray light, she looked old. Not the imposing, ageless authority figure that Ilara remembered from childhood, but a tired woman in a stone courtyard whose gamble had failed in the most spectacular way possible. She did not speak. She inclined her head a fraction of an inch and stepped back. It was over, except it was not over because the healer Thorn was not in the compound. He had left. 3 days ago, according to the pack records, the same day, Caden's riders arrived with the formal challenge. He had taken his supplies and his books, and he had disappeared into and no one had thought to stop him because no one knew why he would run. Ilara knew. Thorn had sealed her wolf. He was the only person alive who knew how the seal worked, which meant he was the only person who could verify that it was breaking down on its own without his intervention, which meant he could reactivate it. The thought hit her like a blade between the ribs, colder and sharper than any wound she had ever treated. If Thorn could seal a Moonblood wolf at birth, he could do it again. He could find her, and he could place his hands on her chest, and he could push her wolf back behind that wall, and she would be empty again, hollow, wolfless. The copper-tasted laundry water girl with nothing inside her but stolen knowledge and a vial of poison she no longer carried. She told Kael. He listened with his jaw set and his amber eyes burning, and the wolf behind them pressing forward with an urgency that made the air taste like static. Find him, Kael said to his commander. Every scout we have, every tracker, I want him found before nightfall. But it was not Kael's scouts who found Thorn, it was Thorn who found them. He came at dusk when the compound was settling into the uneasy peace of a power transfer. He came through the eastern wall through a gap in the stones that only someone who had lived there for decades would know about. And he came directly for Ilara. She was in the healer's quarter the first time she had entered it through the front door instead of sneaking through the window. She was inventorying the medicine stores, making notes in her clinical hand, cataloging what was useful and what was expired and what was actively dangerous. She was alone because she had asked to be alone because the inventory required concentration and because she had spent 4 years learning to do her best work in solitude. She heard him before she saw him. The creak of a floorboard behind the supply shelves. The particular rustle of a healer's coat, heavy cotton with deep pockets weighted down by glass vials. And a smell she recognized from somewhere buried in her earliest memory before language, before awareness. A smell that her infant self had known and that her wolf locked behind her wall was now screaming about. Camphor blood moss silver nitrate, the scent signature of the man who had sealed her. She turned around. Thorn was nothing like she expected. She had imagined him as a villain, a dark figure with cruel hands and cold eyes. Instead, he was a small, slight man in his 60s with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of face you would forget 5 minutes after seeing it. His hands were steady, but his eyes were not. They moved constantly, scanning the room, assessing exits, calculating distances. The eyes of a man who had been running for 3 days and had stopped running only because he had something to do that was more important than escape. I knew they would come for me, he said. His voice was quiet, unremarkable. The voice of a man who gave a routine examination. Nothing to worry about. Take these herbs twice daily, so I came for you first. He had a syringe. She saw it in his right hand, a glass barrel filled with dark liquid, and she knew with the clinical certainty of a healer what it was. Concentrated sealing compound. The same substance he had used on her when she was 3 days old, modified, strengthened enough to force her wolf back behind the barrier and lock it permanently. The council ordered this, he said. 23 years ago, they said you were a threat to pack stability. They said a Moonblood would disrupt the hierarchy. He stepped closer and the syringe caught the light. I told them there were other options, training, integration, supervised development of the gift. They said no. He stopped. His hand was shaking now, a fine tremor visible in the glass barrel. They said seal her or we will kill her. Ilara stood very still. The silver light was in her hands again pulsing, and the wolf inside her was pressing against the barrier with a force that made her ribs ache. And you chose to seal me, she said. I chose to let you live. The words hung in the air between them. She looked at his face and saw the thing she had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Not a villain, not a monster, a man who had been given an impossible choice by people with more power than him, and who had made the decision he could live with, and who had spent 23 years living with it, and who was now standing in front of the consequence of that choice with a syringe full of compound and eyes that could not stop moving. I cannot let the seal break completely, he said. If your wolf fully manifests, she will be. He paused, searching for the word. She will be beyond anything I have seen. The records say that a fully realized Moonblood can heal mortal wounds with a touch, can calm an army of wolves with a single howl, can see injuries before they happen, reading the fault lines in a body like a seismologist reads the earth. You will not be controllable, not by me, not by the council, not by anyone. His voice dropped. Not even by your mate. I am not interested in being controlled, Ilara said. I know, Thorn said. That is why I am here, because if I do not seal you again, they will send someone who will do worse. Who, she said. But she did not get the answer because the wall behind Thorn exploded inward. It was not Kael, it was Kael's wolf, the storm wolf. And in the enclosed space of the healer's quarter, it was the most terrifying thing Ilara had ever seen in her life. It was enormous, black as deep water with amber eyes that burned like signal fires, and it filled the room from wall to wall, its shoulders brushing the ceiling, its breath hot enough to fog the glass jars on the shelves. The darkness gathered around it like a cloak, and the shadows in the room deepened and stretched, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees. Thorn froze. The syringe fell from his hand and shattered on the stone floor, the ceiling compound spreading in a dark puddle. He backed against the wall, and the wolf advanced one massive paw after another, claws scoring the stone, a growl building in its chest that Ilara felt in her fillings. She stepped between them. The wolf stopped. Those amber eyes. Kael's eyes looked down at her, and the growl died in his throat. And the thing she had done for him 2 nights ago on the edge of the camp, the Moonblood calming, happened again without her choosing it. The silver light poured from her hands, and the wolf shuddered and whined, and the darkness around him receded, and he was Kael again, crouching on the stone floor, naked and breathing hard, his eyes wild. He is not going to hurt me, she said. She was not sure this was true. She said it anyway. He had a syringe, Kael said. His voice was not human yet, thick and rumbling. I know. She knelt beside him and put her hands on his face, and the bond between them was so bright now, so loud, that she thought the people outside must be able to hear it. I know what it was, and I know why he made it. She paused, and I'm not afraid of it. She turned to Thorn, who was pressed against the wall with his glasses askew and his healer's coat torn, looking at the shattered syringe on the floor. You said someone sent you, she said. Someone worse. Who? Thorn closed his eyes. Counselor Aldrich, he said. He split from the others 2 days ago. He has allies in the northern packs. He is building a coalition. He plans to petition the Continental Council to have your wolf declared a threat to pack stability under Article 17. If they agree, they can authorize a forced sealing by any qualified healer. Or what Kael said. He had found a blanket from the supply shelf and wrapped it around his waist, and he was standing now 6.5 feet of Alpha King in a borrowed blanket, and under other circumstances it might have been funny. Or termination, Thorn said. The word was very small and very precise, and it sat in the room like a needle on a table. Kael moved toward the door, but Ilara caught his arm. Wait, she said. He looked at her. The wolf was in his eyes again, pressing forward, and she could feel through the bond the specific quality of his fury, not hot but cold, the deep, frigid rage of a man who had found the thing he spent his life waiting for, and was now being told that someone wanted to take it away. Thorn Ilara said, Can you undo the seal? He blinked. What? The seal you placed on me 23 years ago. It is breaking down. The mate bond accelerated the process, but it is not complete. My wolf is... She searched for the words. She is partially manifested, partially awake. Can you remove the seal entirely? Can you set her free? Thorn looked at his hands. They were still shaking. I designed the seal, he said slowly. So yes, theoretically, I can reverse it, but I have never done it. The process would be... He pushed his glasses up his nose. Painful and irreversible. And your wolf, when she fully manifests, she will be powerful in ways that I cannot predict, and that frankly frighten me. Good, Ilara said. The unsealing took place at midnight in the courtyard of the Grey March compound under a sky choked with stars. It was not a ceremony. There was no ritual, no incantation, no circle of elders chanting by firelight. It was a medical procedure performed by a frightened healer on a stone table while an Alpha King stood guard and 300 wolves watched from the walls. Thorn worked with the precise apologetic efficiency of a man performing an operation he had hoped never to perform. His hands moved over Ilara's chest, pressing at points she could not see, and she felt the seal, the way you feel a splinter being drawn out, a deep, specific pain followed by a rush of relief so intense it was almost its own kind of agony. The wolf came. She came all at once this time, not in fragments, but whole, a silver presence that erupted through the barrier like water through a broken dam. Ilara arched off the stone table, and the howl that tore from her throat was not a sound a human could make. It was a frequency, a wavelength, a thing that traveled through the bodies of every wolf in the courtyard and did what Moonblood howls were said to do in the old texts. It healed. 300 wolves, many of them carrying old injuries, scars, badly knit bones, chronic pain from years of fighting, felt the silver sound move through them and felt things shift. Not dramatically, not miraculously, but perceptibly. A shoulder that had ached for a decade settled. A knee that had never been right since a fall straightened by a fraction. A ringing in the ears that a warrior had accepted as permanent faded to silence. The courtyard was quiet for a long time after the howl ended. Ilara sat up on the stone table. Her eyes were silver, fully silver. No iris and no pupil, just light, and the glow from her skin illuminated the courtyard in a pale wash that made the stone walls look like they were made of moonlight. She looked down at her hands. She turned them over. She flexed her fingers and watched the silver light pulse in time with her heartbeat. And she thought about the laundry, about the copper vat, and the red marks on her arms, and the 4 years of bed sheets, and the stolen books, and the sewing needle sutures, and she thought about the night's bane in its glass vial, and the way it had smelled like lavender and something wrong. She thought about the woman who had brewed that poison, and she realized that she didn't recognize her anymore. Not because that woman was gone, but because that woman had been walking toward this moment without knowing it. Every stolen book and every secret surgery and every yarrow poultice pressed into her own wound, a step on a road that led here to this table, to this light, to this wolf rising in her chest like a second heartbeat. Kael climbed the steps to the table. He was dressed now, black armor, though he had left the gauntlets off and his hands were bare. He stood in front of her, and the amber of his eyes met the silver of hers, and the bond between them was visible now, actually visible. A thread of light gold and silver twisted together running from his chest to hers, humming with a frequency that the wolves in the courtyard could hear and that made several of them press their hands over their own hearts. The claiming was simple. In the old tradition, before politics and ceremony complicated it, a claiming was just this two wolves facing each other choosing. Kael tilted his head, exposing the left side of his neck. She understood. In the mate bond, the mark went both ways, not the alpha claiming the omega, not the king claiming the subject. Two wolves marking each other equal. She pressed her mouth against his neck, and her teeth found the place where his pulse ran closest to the surface, and she bit down and tasted his blood, hot and copper and salt, and the bond locked into place with a sound like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting to be opened. He made a sound low, broken the sound of a man who had been holding something for 15 years and had just been told he could put it down. His hands came up to her shoulders, and he pulled her against him, and his mouth found her, and his teeth pressed into her skin, gentle and then not gentle, and the mark bloomed on her throat like a silver brand, like a door, like a beginning. The courtyard erupted. 300 wolves, many of them former Grey March members who had watched a quiet Omega boil their sheets for 4 years, raised their voices in acknowledgement. Not all of them understood. Not all of them approved, but the bond was visible and the howl was still ringing in their healed bones, and the Alpha King of Blackthorn was standing on a stone table in their courtyard with silver light on his face, cradling a woman they had thrown away, and even the least perceptive among them could see that something had shifted in the structure of the world. Connell was in the crowd. Ilara saw him from the table standing near the back, his arms at his sides, his face complicated. He did not cheer, he did not look away. He watched, and when her eyes found his, he did something that she would think about for a long time afterward. He opened his hands, palms up, a gesture that was not apology and not supplication and not surrender, just openness, just a man showing his empty hands to a woman he had failed and saying without words, "I see what I did. I cannot undo it. I am not asking you to forgive me." She inclined her head to him a fraction of an inch, the same gesture Marine had given Kael. It meant, "I see you too." It was enough. Counselor Aldrich was found 4 days later by Kael's scouts at a northern pack stronghold. He had indeed been building a coalition. He had indeed petitioned the Continental Council. The petition was denied. The Continental Council, upon being presented with evidence that the Grey March Elder Council had performed an unauthorized wolf sealing on an infant, was considerably more interested in investigating the Grey March leadership than in authorizing action against a Moonblood wolf. Aldrich was brought to the Grey March compound in chains. He was a tall man, thin, with the kind of face that looked like it had been designed for portraits, dignified patrician, the face of a man who believed in systems. Kael gave him to Ilara. Not literally, not for punishment, for judgment. Under the old laws, the injured party had the right to determine consequence. and Kael, who understood power in ways that most kings didn't understood, that this was Ilara's to decide. She looked at Aldrich for a long time. He stood in the courtyard in chains, and his face was the face she had expected Marines to be, the face she had expected Thorns to be. A closed face, a face that had made calculations and stood by them and would make them again. "You will serve," she said, "in the healer's quarter under Vasek. You will learn what it means to treat the wounded and the weak and the wolfless. You will do this for 1 year. If at the end of that year Vasek tells me you have learned something, you will be released. If he tells me you have not, you will serve another year." Aldrich stared at her. This was not the judgment he had expected. A king would have killed him, a warrior would have imprisoned him. And Omega, the Omega he had tried to have destroyed, was sentencing him to learn empathy. It was the cruelest punishment she could have devised, and she knew it. The days that followed were not a fairy tale. They were complicated and messy, and full of administrative details that no story ever bothered to include. The Grey March Pack needed restructuring. The war with the remaining hostile packs needed ending. Ilara's wolf, fully manifested, needed training that no one alive had the expertise to provide. She figured it out the way she had figured everything out, by reading and experimenting and making careful notes in the margins of stolen books. She set up a medical clinic in the Grey March Healer's Quarter. She trained 3 assistants, 2 of them former Omegas, one of them a warrior who had lost his arm and discovered he had more interest in healing than fighting. Vasek visited weekly and argued with her about suture techniques, and they published a joint paper on field medicine that was circulated to every pack on the continent. Thorn stayed. He was not imprisoned, he was not punished. He worked in the clinic as a consultant, quiet and precise, his glasses perpetually sliding down his nose, and sometimes Ilara would look up from a patient and see him watching her with an expression that contained so many things she could not untangle them all. Pride and guilt and wonder and grief braided together the face of a man who had made the worst decision of his life for the best reason he could find, and who was now watching the full consequence of that decision walk around in silver light, healing people with the hands he had tried to bind. She didn't forgive him. Forgiveness was not a medical procedure, and she didn't know how to perform it. But she let him stay, and sometimes when the clinic was empty and the lanterns burned low, they talked about pharmacology, and he told her things about Moonblood healing that were not in any book because they had never been written down. And she wrote them down. Kael ruled. He was good at it, better than his reputation suggested, patient with logistics and brutal only when patience failed. His wolf was quieter now. The 15 years of restless fury, soothed by the bond, by the silver light of Ilara's hands on his skin at night, by the simple unprecedented fact of not being alone. He still had nightmares. He still woke with his teeth too sharp and his eyes too bright and the shadows in their bedroom too dark. But she was there, and the moonblood in her blood sang his wolf to stillness, and he slept, and in the morning she told him he had dimples and he denied it, and they argued about it with the specific fond intensity of 2 people who had found each other in the mud and the blood and the dark and had against all evidence and all history to stay. The night's bane stain was still on the tent floor. They kept the tent packed among the campaign supplies, and once months later, Ilara found the dark mark on the canvas floor where the poison had soaked in. She knelt beside it and pressed her fingertips against it, and the silver light in her hands neutralized the remaining toxin, turning the dark stain clear. She stayed there for a moment, kneeling on the canvas, her fingers spread over the place where the poison had been. The tent smelled like old wax and wood smoke, and the particular warmth of a space that had held something important. She thought about the woman who had carried the vial across the Ashen Moor. She thought about the door that woman had kept in her pocket, the glass tube of exit, the comfort of knowing she could leave. She did not need the door anymore, but she would not pretend it had never existed. It was part of the architecture, part of the road. She stood up. The tent flap was open, and through it she could see the compound courtyard, winter sunlight on stone, and Kael crossing toward the clinic with 2 cups of tea, one of them too sweet because he could never remember how much honey she wanted and always erred on the side of too much. Ilara walked out of the tent and into the light and took the cup from his hand. The tea was too sweet. His fingers were warm, the mate mark on her neck pulsed once silver and gold, and somewhere inside her the wolf stretched and settled and was still.